Hi, I'm Dean Johnson from Home Time. In the past few years, we've seen a real resurgence in the interest in hardwood floors. They're attractive and can really add value to your home. In this videotape, we'll show you how to refinish one. We'll also show you how to install a pre-finished wood floor and a solid unfinished wood floor. We'll do this by showing you some projects that I've worked on with co-hosts Robin Hartle and Joanne Liebler, right after this.
Home Time is made possible by Chevy full-size pickup, the most dependable, longest-lasting full-size pickup on the road. At Home Time, we believe the best way to get the job done is to use the finest tools.
And the Chevy Silverado is one of our favorites. Equipped with an optional Vortex 6000 V8 engine, it generates 300 horsepower and 355 foot-pounds of torque to power you through the toughest jobs.
And with an available fourth door, you've got lots of room for all your other tools.
And friends to help you use them.
At home or on the job site.
For work or play.
It's no wonder we at Home Time count on Silverado, the truck, to get the job done.
Silverado from Chevy, the most dependable, longest-lasting trucks on the road.
Refinishing a hardwood floor is a great way to increase the value of your living space. You just want to make sure your floor is a good candidate before you do it. Well, for instance, if the subfloor is really soft or kind of squishy, or if the wood is really squeaking quite a bit, or let's say if the wood is buckled or warped, you might just want to replace it.
On the other hand, if the floor's in pretty good shape, then it might just need to have the old wax buffed off and a new wax applied.
Now, another thing to consider when you're sanding the surfaces, you'll be taking a little bit off the top, so you can only do this so many times, especially if you're working with laminated veneer flooring where the surface may only be 1/8 of an inch or less of solid hardwood. So what you can do is peel up a heat register and look at the profile of the wood, or find an area like we have on our floor where we can see the edge of the floor to tell that we have solid 3/4 inch oak. Shouldn't be a problem.
Our floor isn't too beat up. It's still relatively smooth, but the finishes wore off in places. It absorbs spills and never really comes clean. In fact, over by the fireplace, we've got some stains. We've got a cracked plank here that can be replaced, and some of these wood plugs are missing. So refinishing this floor should do the trick.
Well, this big sander is probably the #1 reason why people decide they're not going to finish their own floors. And for good reason. This can really gouge a floor. So you have to be careful. It does take a certain technique. Now, this is the same basic sander that professionals use, although this plugs into standard 110 house current rather than 220. Ready? All set? Yeah.
It's kind of heavy.
Yeah.
Well, sanding creates a lot of dust, so I've covered all the furniture with plastic. I'm also sealing this room off from the rest of the house. But we still need to get through here. So I'm creating an access with this closure system. What this is basically a couple of sticky back zippers that are stuck to the plastic. What you end up with is a big flap-like door that seals with these and rolls up and out of the way when you need to get in and out.
So you guys need me to do anything else?
No, let's set it down right here. All right. Thanks, Bucky.
You bet. Good luck. I'll send you the bill.
I'm looking for it.
Now, before we actually fire up the sander, we want to make sure that there are no nail heads sticking up, because that can rip the sandpaper and it might even damage the machine. If you find one, what you want to do is, I've got a couple over here, is pound them down with a hammer and a nail set until they're just below the surface. There we go. And we'll fill these later on. Sometimes you'll find staples, especially if the floor had been carpeted over at some point. You can just pull those out with a set of pliers.
Well, this is basically like a big belt sander. I'm just sliding the sanding belt over the drum and I'll be all set to go. I'm starting with a coarse grit, which is generally considered something between 20 and 40 grit. Now, the plan is to make 3 passes on the floor. First time with a coarse, the second time with a medium, and then the last one with a fine. I'm starting out with 40 grit. If that starts to gum up during the sanding process, then I'll switch over to the 20.
It's also important to cover any heat ducts and cold air returns in the room. That keeps any sanding dust from spreading out throughout the rest of the house. It also keeps any dirt from blowing in on the wet finish. Found them!
Okay. Well, we've made some pretty good progress here on our first cut. We're obviously going to start working with the edger to hit the outside areas that I can't get with the sander. Now the objective here is to get this as clean and as level as possible. You notice I'm going with the grain of the wood. The only exception to that is if you really have a rough floor. Then you want to make your first pass diagonally. Well, at any rate, these sanders have such a notorious reputation of taking too much wood at once that I decided to start by practicing a little bit in the center of the room. Well, the idea is to keep the machine moving as you raise or lower the belt. This feathers it into and out of your work. Also, you want to keep the pace slow and even. If you stop or pause for even a few seconds, it could really gouge the floor. Well, once I got the feel for it, I started in the center of the room, going down and back on the same path, making sure all the finish came off. If there's a little finish left, then I made a second pass. Otherwise, I moved over about 4 inches and made the next pass overlapping the one before it just a little bit. Well, I have 2/3 of it done, so now I can spin this guy around and finish off the other third.
The other sander we're using is called an edger. It's got a sanding disc, the same grit as Dean's. With this thing, we can get right up to the edge. And there's a definite technique for using this sander too. Now, the front of the disc does most of the cutting, so I've been running that right along the baseboard on the side wall with a back and forth motion, again, with the grain. With this sander, ease it into the wood as you start the motion to feather into the work. On the end walls, where the planks butt up against the wall, you want to use a slightly different motion. Work along the baseboard just enough to clean up the wood, then move the edger in and out towards the baseboard, again, to sand with the grain of the wood.
Well, we're pretty much done with our first pass. We've leveled everything out and opened up the grain on the wood. Now I'm moving on to the medium grit. I'll also start to close the wood back up and also smooth out any of the marks made by the coarser grit. Now, a sanding belt like this should go about 300 square feet, which is just about exactly what we've got in this room.
I'm changing to a medium grit on the edger too. You want to make sure that it's centered. Otherwise, it could tear into the baseboard when you're working up against it.
Well, now is also a good time to look for shiners, which are nails that are exposed after the first cut. We're coming up with a few of them here.
The second pass doesn't really take that much more off. It just pretty much smooths everything out. Say, do you mind if I try this for a while?
No, go ahead. Well, we've made our first couple of cuts already, but before we make the third cut, we want to take care of all of our floor repairs. So this way, once the repairs are done and we make our third cut, everything will be nice and smooth. Now, to get rid of this cracked plank, I made some plunge cuts, and I'm just using a chisel to get everything out of here.
Some more of these plugs popped out while we were sanding, and I'm replacing them with these black walnut plugs. But first, I need to clean out these holes with a 1/2-inch boring bit. And then it's just a matter of gluing them up with carpenter's glue. There we go, setting it down in. And you want to leave it up just a little bit because the glue will suck it down in and the sander will sand it smooth.
Well, I cut the bottom lip off this new piece of tongue and groove flooring. So this way now it should just drop right into our little opening. But first I have to get this thing measured for length and get it cut off.
One of the big questions that comes up is what to do about the gaps in between the boards. Well, there's no simple answer to that because, for one thing, the variation of temperature and humidity between the seasons is going to cause the wood to expand and contract, and the gaps give it room to do that. So it's really just a matter of knowing your floor's characteristics and how it reacts to your climate. Anyway, we decided to fill only the real obvious end gaps because the floor isn't going to expand very much that way.
Well, there's a couple of different ways that I'll be attaching this piece of wood. First thing we'll be doing is gluing it down to the subfloor. Get this all spread out. And then I'll also be screwing through the top. I've already, get this loosened up here, I've already pre-drilled the top for our little plugs, and then also pre-drilled and countersunk for the wood screws that will go through here. Now, if you don't have these plugs in your floor, then your best bet is just to face nail the board, countersink the nail, and then putty everything in.
Well, we're done making our repairs and we've started on the final sanding. And this step is probably the most critical because this is where your sanding has to be the most consistent. Any variations in your work will show up when you start to put the stain down.
Now for this step, we're doing the edge first and then we come by with a drum sander. So I'm working out about 10 inches from the edge of the wall. Then Robin will come by with a drum sander, try to get as close to the wall as possible to kind of feather everything out. The reason we do it this way is a drum sander does a much smoother job than the edger. Now, it'd be great to use power tools to sand all this stuff, but unfortunately there are spots like corners like this where you just can't get at them with a power tool. So here you have to use a paint scraper filed to a nice sharp edge. This works pretty well. Now, if you have radiators, you might be able to find a special unit at a rental store that allows you to sand underneath the radiator. Those work real well.
Now I'm working my way around the room with this palm sander and a piece of 100 grit paper like we used for the final sanding. This should even out the transition between the edger and the drum sander even more.
All right, now the last step in sanding is this buffing process. And here we're using a 100 grit screen that just friction fits on the bottom of the buffer. The buffer just sits on the screen and friction holds it in place. Now this machine takes a little getting used to. At first it wants to pull you all over the place. But once you get the feel for it, it's not too bad. If you work it from left to right with the grain, you'll get the best results. What this machine does is to even out all the work done by the other sanders. It tightens up the grain so the stain takes more evenly.
Now, between the sanders, the buffer, and the hand scraping, stripping a floor can really wear you out. But if you've got a couple people working on it, then sanding and staining an average size room should only take about a day. Now, before you start any staining, you want to make sure that the room is literally dust-free. We don't want any dust or dirt floating around in here when we start putting down the finishes. This is really important. So that's why I'm going to be vacuuming everything that could possibly be collecting dust, including the windowsills, the baseboard, the walls, basically everything.
Well, with all the vacuuming done, we can finally start the staining process. Now, we're going to be working with an oil-based stain. There are water-based stains available. They go on about the same. You still should check the directions, though. Pay close attention to the drying time. Now, we've been playing around with putting some of the stain color on a piece of wood. This is the best way to check out the color. You can look at brochures all day long. They have the color samples on, but this is the most accurate way to take a look at the stain color. In fact, even a more accurate way to do it is to take a little bit of the stain and put it in the center of the room. If you don't like the color, you can just sand it off and try another color. How's it coming?
Got everything set.
Okay. Well, we're going to start working on one side of the room and go to the other, following the grain of the wood. Now, I'm just going to kind of rag the stain on the floor, and then Robin's going to wipe it off. Now, we're going to work in a strip that's wide enough so we can reach everything comfortably, but at the same time so we don't have to stretch too far. So just do that very carefully. And you always want to keep going with the grain of the wood. That's the important thing. Designate a board that you want to go up against for your strip, and then try not to go beyond that. Now, we're being very careful up against the base because we don't want to put any tape up there. It just seeps underneath anyway. So just do that very carefully. Now, you only need to put on enough stain to cover the wood completely. Anything more, we'll just have to wipe it off anyway.
Now you want to wipe with the grain to get all the material off so there's nothing left on the wood. I'm going to change rags often as these become soaked. You want to try not to walk on this at all if you can help it, because any moisture on the shoes will cause the grain to raise up, and then you'll see footsteps on the finished coat.
Now, this whole process should go fairly quickly. I don't think it'll take us much more than a half hour to get this whole room done. Now, the stain will stay wet enough when we come back down to do the other strip, we don't have to worry about any lap marks. At the same time, it is designed to dry in about 4 hours, so we could conceivably put a top coat on at that point, but we're still going to let this dry overnight before we go to the first top coat.
That back wall is all ready for you.
Okay, I'll be in there in a second. Well, we let the stain dry overnight, so we're all set. And that's really important, especially with the situation we've got, where we're using a water-based finish over the top of an oil-based stain. If that stain isn't completely dry, you can really botch your job up. In fact, we turned up the heat in this room just to make sure everything was dry.
What I'm doing now is cutting in around the room with this foam pad, being real careful not to get any finish on the baseboard or anything else. As soon as I've cut in enough, then Dean will start with the other applicator.
Well, I'm using a foam applicator on a long pole. There's also lamb's wool applicators available, whichever type you use. It's a good idea to rinse it off with either water or mineral spirits, depending on the type of finish you're going with. This will help prevent fibers from getting into the finish. Another thing that I'm using is a watering bucket. Now, this may seem like a fairly strange piece of equipment to use for this, but it's a real good way to apply the finish. I put a little straining cloth here on the end. That'll help strain out any dirt particles. And with this, I can pour a band of finish along the wall. Opposite the door, of course, because you don't want to paint yourself into a corner. All right, now I can just use the applicator to spread it out. Now again, working with the grain, I drag the material with kind of a snowplow technique. Now this will leave behind just the right amount of finish. You can move fairly quickly as long as you don't get ahead of the person cutting in.
One nice thing about using a water-based finish is the fast dry time. Basically, we're able to put down 2 coats, buff, vacuum, and put down a 3rd coat all in one day. But because of this, we have to work pretty fast, keeping a wet edge just like we did when we put down the stain.
Now, when you get to the end, you just want to carefully turn the applicator around through the edge that's been cut and lift it out. Dab off the excess on the next area you're going to cover, and then go back and feather into the next strip, snow plowing the material towards the center of the room. Now it seems to be going pretty good. Be careful to hold this so that your excess material doesn't go back into the work you've already done.
And the stuff is kind of milky going on, but it clears as it dries. And that's one of the indicators that we'll use when we decide when to put the next coat on. Okay.
Then after a couple of passes, you'll run out of material, so just grab the water can and put down another line of material.
Well, we went ahead and put down the second coat. And now I'm buffing that because the first two coats really raise the grain and leave the surface pretty rough. So what I did was I took a piece of used sanding screen and I dulled it even more by rubbing it with sandpaper and then buffed the floor with that. Anyway, we let the first coat dry for about 2 hours. The second coat went on using the same techniques as the first, cutting in around the edges and working the material across the floor. We also let that one dry a couple hours. Before we buffed, we sanded along the walls and in the corners with 150 grit paper where the buffer won't reach. Thanks. Now, water-based urethanes tend to go on thinner, so if that's what you're using, then try not to buff any more than you absolutely have to, or you could buff right through the finish. Now this feels pretty smooth, but I'm going to give it one more pass with just the floor pad. This is even less abrasive, so it should smooth everything out. Okay.
Once we had finished screening the second top coat, we vacuumed the floor again to take up all the dust, and we used a damp rag to make sure the surface was totally clean. Then we applied a third coat of the same water-based polyurethane finish, again, cutting in the corners first, pouring out the finish, and using the foam applicator to cover the floor. After this coat dried, the floor was done, and that should give you a pretty good idea of what's involved with refinishing an existing wood floor. Now we're going to show you what's involved with installing a new wood floor. Most people go with pre-finished planks, but unfinished wood flooring is also available, and we'll talk about both. Also, you can either nail down your new wood floor, or you can float it over a foam underlayment. So we'll cover both of those options as well.
Whatever type of wood flooring you choose, first make sure the subfloor is in good shape. Preferably it's plywood, at least 3/4 of an inch thick. But you can also add a layer of 1/2-inch plywood over an existing subfloor, as Joanne Liebler and I did on one of our earlier projects. And always run the new flooring perpendicular to the joist for maximum support.
Before starting any wood flooring project, it also makes sense to cut off the bottoms of your door jambs and casing so the new flooring slides in underneath the trim rather than having to notch around it. Jamb saws are specially made for this job. Just use a scrap of the new flooring as a guide to give you the right height. As for the actual installation, let's start with the nail-down, pre-finished wood floor Dean and I worked on at one of our addition projects.
Okay, got it. It used to be that installing a new wood floor was a multi-step process, nailing it down, sanding, staining, and finishing it. But with these pre-finished planks, it's pretty much just a one-step process.
Yeah, they come with a urethane finish and the stain color we ordered. Now we figure it costs us about $6 per square foot to install these ourselves. And that compares to about $9 per square foot to install and finish regular wood flooring. So we're saving about 30%.
The flooring runs from the family room into the kitchen, and we want the seams to be nice and straight. So we snapped a chalk line parallel to this wall and extended it into the kitchen as a guideline.
We start with the first row up against the wall, but we don't use the wall as a guide, especially in older homes. This could be out of line.
Yeah, so what we did is measured back from this first chalk line and marked off this guideline. You ready to cut that first one?
Just about all set. Now we're putting the groove side up against the wall, and I place these little spacers here to make sure we have enough room for expansion up against the wall. Now the first thing I want to do is cut out this little area here above the heating duct.
Okay, got it.
Ah, thanks. I'll nail through the back of this board and through the tongue. There's gap back here, and the nails will be covered up later with base and base shoe.
Okay, right there.
Now we'll just finish the rest of this first wall and work our way out across the floor.
Now this is a power floor nailer. It's hooked up to an electric air compressor. It has a fairly wide base, so you can't get it too close to the wall, which means you can't use it to do the first row. But once you hit the open field like this, you can really move the thing, so it's definitely worth renting if you're going to be doing a lot of flooring.
These nailers can throw the planks offline, so if you've got any crooked seams, they're going to be really obvious. Those blocks that we set up earlier against the wall also help to hold things in place. Now, we're going to be measuring every so often from the snap chalk line to the boards that we're working on, just to keep things equal. Okay, that looks good over there.
Okay.
One thing to remember about wood floors is that wood needs to adjust to the humidity in your house, and that's pretty important. Otherwise, you'll have problems down the road. Now, dry wood swells in humid areas, and wet wood shrinks when it dries. I'm going to get some more wood.
Okay.
If you install your wood flooring right off the truck, you could get gaps or buckling at the joints, which looks pretty bad. To avoid this, open up the box and let them sit for a couple of days to adjust to the humidity level. Got it. Wow. Here we go.
That covers the basic steps of nailing down a new pre-finished wood floor. On a different project, Joanne Liebler and I nailed down an unfinished solid oak floor. The basic techniques are the same, but let's show you a couple variations that might be applicable on your project. For example, we plan to have the new wood floor run into an angled step down at one opening into the room. So we first cut and installed a piece of oak step nosing to finish the edge of that. Nosing is a type of floorboard routed on the bottom so the back of the board stays flush along the step and the front edge hangs over the riser like a stair tread. Nosing like this gets a lot of wear and tear, so we both glued the bottom and nailed it down to hold it securely. With the nosing in, we then set a baseline for the first board, measuring off the wall as we did on the earlier project. But with unfinished wood flooring, it's a good idea to leave at least a ½ inch gap against the wall for expansion and contraction. If you take your base trim off before starting, it'll cover the gap when you put it back on. Now add that gap to the width of the flooring, which was 2 1/4 inches in this case, and snap a chalk line that distance from the wall. Then you're ready for the first course. In this case, we started in the open floor along the nosing, so we first nailed down a temporary guide board to keep the first board in line as we secured it. We also spread glue under it to help secure it. By the way, we mitered all the boards on this end to fit flush against the angled nosing. And after pre-drilling the first oak board, we face nailed it to secure it in place since the floor nailer might have knocked it offline. Now notice that we set the tongue and groove board with the groove against the guide board. Then we use the floor nailer to drive a nail through the tongue, which will later be hidden by the groove of the next board. That's called blind nailing. The next few boards of the first course carried us along the wall, so we face nailed those to secure them. But we also pre-drilled and nailed each one through the tongues to fully secure them. The nailer doesn't fit against the wall, so we used a hammer. Once we moved on to the second course, we had plenty of room for the nailer. This one doesn't need power or a compressor, but it does need a pretty good pop to drive each nail. By the way, after gluing the first course to the subfloor, we rolled 15-pound builder's felt over the subfloor and started setting the boards. It helps limit squeaks and creaks. You can also use plastic or rosin paper.
With tongue and groove flooring, you always want to be setting the groove of one board against the tongue of the previous board. But sometimes you have to change direction with a do-it-yourself tongue known as a spline. You glue up one side and set it in the groove of your starting board. Then the groove of the next board will slip over the spline as you start working in that direction. To finish a floor, you'll probably end up against a wall, so you may have to rip the last course to fit. You won't be able to use the nailer, but you can spread some glue on the subfloor and set the boards over that. Now use a pry bar to get them tight against the previous boards and then face nail them to fully secure them. Then with unfinished flooring like this, you sand, stain, and finish the boards as we showed you at the beginning of the tape. Now for the last segment of the tape, we'd like to show you the basic steps in floating a wood floor, like the engineered product we used in one of our addition projects.
Now we're using these engineered wood planks. They're a ½ inch thick. We're going to be setting them on top of our radiant floor. Now these are made with 3 different layers. I don't know if you can see that or not. It makes them a lot more stable as the temperature is rising and falling on the floor as well as the humidity.
There's still going to be some movement though, so rather than gluing or nailing, we're floating the floor on top of this foam underlayment and leaving some small gaps at the walls for expansion. That's critical to prevent any buckling or separation at the glue joints.
Now with a system like this, the tongue and grooves fit very precisely, which is great for a nice fitting floor, but at the same time, if the humidity gets too high, it can be just about impossible to install. So we really recommend that you keep them in the package before you install them. And of course, like any hardwood floor, it's always great to acclimate it to the space prior to installation.
Now this underlayment is really nice since it has this little adhesive strip along the edges, so when you put it down it'll stick rather than slide around. And it's also somewhat transparent so you can see your guidelines as you're moving along.
Now in floating a wood floor like this, they always recommend that you run it parallel to the longest wall in the room. And then you don't start by laying the flooring right up against that wall. Instead, what you do is measure out one width of the flooring from the wall at a ½ inch for expansion and contraction, and then lay in a straight edge. And then shim that straight edge out from the wall so it's good and solid. Then you start laying the flooring up against that. Now the reason is, if your wall isn't perfectly straight, and most walls aren't, that any undulations or anything will start showing up in your joints. By doing it this way, everything stays nice and tight, just the way you want it. I'm going to cut this. I'll be right back. Now for our stand-up here, we went with a wine color, which comes very close to matching the Cabernet color on some of our cabinets. But for the floor, we went with a contrasting color. This is what they call country cherry. Now I think it's very important to realize, you want to glue up the inside, here's the glue. Whenever you're working with engineered wood flooring like this, the colors may vary slightly from box to box. So it makes a lot of sense to open up 2 boxes and then just pull every other one from each of those so that you don't end up with alternating bands of different shades as you're running across the floor. Okay.
Well, that should give you a good idea of how to install wood flooring and how to refinish it. I'm Robin Hartle.
And I'm Dean Johnson. Thanks for watching.